So I said, let's play shuffleboard. He said, you don't play shuffleboard. I don't know the rules. I don't know if that's allowed, if it's what. Okay, the time has come. Steve Weiner here from GetRubix.com. Don't really know how to do the intro to this. Our guest today is somebody that I had the pleasure of meeting quite a few years ago when I started working on Autopilot and Intune. I guess it seems fitting that today Autopilot V2 was announced and everyone's excited about that. And we are back with our 20th episode of the podcast. And our guest today is Mr. Michael Niehaus. I mean, I would think that move is illegal if you're... We'll talk about this later when you go to do the podcast now. Shuffleboard. Get out of here.
Now, I was just remembering back the first time we met in Bothell,
Yes.
Washington. That was a radical idea at the time, that we were having conversations, troubleshooting customer issues and saying, well, where the heck are you? And then finding out that, oh, you're not that far away. Why don't we just hop in a car and we'll drive up there for the day? So myself and one of my coworkers just drove out and we had an on-site consultation. So
Yeah.
works for me.
Yeah. So I'll have you go ahead and introduce yourself if anyone doesn't know you.
Okay.
Yeah.
My name is Mike Niehaus. I am what do I do these days?
What do
Right
we
now,
call
I'm a
you?
program director at Two Pine Software, working on a variety of network management, OS deployment, systems management stuff. In the past, I've worked for Microsoft and Tanium and Marathon Oil Company. So that would be my complete resume for the last 30 years.
When did you first were you always involved with Autopilot from the inception?
When I was initially involved, it was while I was still in Windows marketing. So not on the engineering side, but more on the naming, messaging, positioning side of things. Trying to come up with a name for it was an interesting exercise by itself. A lot of the initial marketing that the engineering teams were doing, well, you can guess how well engineering teams do marketing. So they were positioning it as a way of simplifying Ubi, that look at how Ubi has like 17 screens on it. And once you introduce Autopilot into the process, now it only has 5. Well, great, but it's Microsoft that caused that complexity, that added the 17 screens in the first place. So why are you trying to market something as a solution to a problem that you caused yourself? So we kind of pivoted things at that point to say, really the right answer is look at how easy this is to do and how you can take a device out of the box and get it ready for productive use with potentially the end user doing all the work.
It wasn't about like displacing imaging in the beginning.
If you go back all the way to the beginning, it was kind of a reaction to a program from IBM. There was something that IBM had announced at a Jamf conference of all things, where they talked about Mac at IBM as a way that employees at IBM could get a new PC. They could choose whatever PC they want. This was in the early days of the choose your PC, bring your own PC type discussions. So the idea that IBM could let employees pick a Mac and have them provision the device themselves was enough to cause a bit of a panic inside of Microsoft. And the reaction to that is what became Autopilot.
As you're talking about, like, I guess that would be the response to like the Apple DEP, Apple Business Manager now, but that whole thing.
Yeah, and IBM was really even ahead of that.
Oh.
They were using Jamf with a whole lot of custom code that they had created themselves to present something that you would roughly think of as what you see in ESP today. Like here's a progress dialog that shows you as your device is being provisioned, all the steps that are taking place. So I think in a lot of ways, they started this revolution both on the Apple side and on the Microsoft side to create a pretty easy capability to do that sort of device provisioning.
Yeah.
Initially on the Windows side with Autopilot, there was no enrollment status page because the idea was, well, you go through Ubi and all this stuff just streams down in the background and your device will eventually be ready. And of course, enterprises came back and said, well, our end users are going to freak out because they're going to sign into the device and expect everything to be there, and they're going to find that it's not. So can we block until the device is actually ready? So the initial versions didn't have that, and those were added later to be able to provide that sort of progress dialogue to show what's going on.
Yeah. I remember the early, I was kind of on the other side, deploying it very early to very, customers who wanted to be cutting edge and cloud only at the time. But I remember the first ESP only locked MSI applications. Because I remember the Autopilot branding, you had to compile it to an MSI to get it to lock there. Yeah. So, but it was great in the beginning because I remember pre-ESP, being all excited and same response, showing people, hey, look at this. They're like, what's it doing? I'm like, I can't tell you what it's doing. I don't know. It's doing the things we set up in Intune. They're like, users have no idea what you're talking about.
The irony is that customers started working around that themselves, and some of the initial attempts were to use MDT. So they would take an MDT task sequence and bundle it into a very big MSI and deliver that down to the device, and it would display a UI and a progress bar and all that good stuff. It's like, well, we really shouldn't require customers go through that number of hoops to get something that behaves the way they want. So ESP was the answer to that. That was built shortly before I switched over to the engineering team. So it was already designed and well into the implementation before I switched over. But the UI design for that was suboptimal. And I think we all looked at that later and said, yeah, this kind of sucks, but it is what it is. It has too much information for the end user. They don't understand it.
Yeah.
The information for IT is not really sufficient, so it's not good for them either. So the hope was always that, oh, hey, at some point we'll redo this UI and provide a more detailed IT admin view, which was supposed to be that diagnostics page that was delivered a while back. But to be able to differentiate, to give you a nice, clean, simple progress bar for the end user, but much more detailed information for the IT admin.
When pre-provisioning first dropped, I know my thought was like, isn't this a step backwards? Because it's not out of the box to the end user, but it's still a good, they're the first person to touch it type of thing.
Yeah, and a lot of that was a reaction to the large enterprise customers who said, there's no way we would let the special people deploy their own devices, whether that's the CEO, the secretary to the CEO, the engineers, whoever these people that typically are handled differently by IT, however they could be deployed, they're not going to want to sit in front of a machine and stare at it for an hour. They want a device dropped in front of them that's fully ready to go. So that was really the reaction there, was to, well, we can split the process in two and let IT, or ideally someone outsourced to do this on behalf of IT, let them get the device ready, do the time-consuming part, and then just plop it in front of the user for them to basically put in their credentials and associate the device with them.
That's cool. Like, that's just a good way to say that was like a good way to split that load without having to worry about privacy and stuff. So it's ultimately been helpful.
Yeah, and the basic idea too was that if you as a service provider optimized this, you could do hundreds of devices at a time and do it super efficiently and low cost, whereas IT in most orgs is going to be doing 1, 2, 10, 20, 50 a day, and they're never going to be as efficient at it. So it's going to be cheaper in those cases to just let someone do it for you.
So two things you brought up that I want to shift to. I guess the first is hybrid join. That's a little bit of a hot topic in the Autopilot community. So I was just at a Microsoft event, and it gets a lot of hate from, I think from, and this was another thing I worked with you on at one point, was a very big hybrid project. And I think a lot of it came down to expectations and what's actually going on. So, I mean, can you talk a little bit about, while you were at Microsoft, what went down with like hybrid join and where it ended up for Autopilot?
Yeah, I mean, from the start, there was a debate of, do we try to meet customers where they are, since everyone is on Active Directory, or do we try to push them forward to cloud? At that point, it wasn't called cloud native. It was really just the typical modern label applied to things. Do we want people to be modern, or do we want them to be hybrid? And it went back and forth because there were certainly a lot of shortcomings in Azure AD Join and a lot of shortcomings that just hadn't yet been addressed in Intune. So it was always then a question of, well, if we push too hard, too early, people will try it and fail, and they'll never try it again. So it did go back and forth a number of times. The initial hybrid approach was implemented in a way that, well, I mean, the whole scenario was designed so that you could do it from anywhere, which became one of the challenges. How do you do a hybrid deployment when you're not on the corporate network? Well, really, you need an always-on VPN of some sort. Always-on VPN in Windows at that point was barely functional. It kind of sucked, but it did work, but only in very specific configurations. And you couldn't go into a customer and say, well, all you had to do is replace your current VPN setup with this barely functional always-on VPN setup. So we had talked about just changing it to say, well, if you can provide a VPN solution of your own that can make connectivity before the end user needs to sign on, then it becomes a whole lot less friction that you can just do this using what you've already got. Now, there were plenty of other challenges like the device registration piece, and when that happens, and when the user logs on, and do they have a user token, and all this other stuff. Some design flaws around computer naming and that sort of thing. So there were plenty of other issues, but a lot of it initially was around that VPN connectivity side of things. And the fix to enable any sort of VPN was like a 5-line code change to be able to say, well, bypass the connectivity check that had been hard-coded into the enrollment status page to say, don't allow you to continue down a process where the end user is not going to be able to sign in because they can't see a domain controller. It would halt up front. But the fix was basically to say, well, bypass that and assume the IT technician knows better and has some ability through, say, Cisco Anywhere integration or something like that. So we made that change in like a day because it was super simple, and then had like the 12-month debate around, do we release it? Which kind of just shows the level of internal debate around, well, what do we really want to do here? Is the goal to drive Azure AD Join? Is the goal to get hybrid in place? Does it matter if a device is cloud registered or cloud joined? And for a long time, the answer was, well, we don't really know. Eventually, all that messaging switched to say, well, we need to push everyone to cloud native. So that's the new buzzword. Everything is cloud native.
Yep.
You need to get rid of all of that legacy stuff. Let's get rid of Active Directory and GPOs and hybrid. Well, that's a nice temporary thing, but when you deploy new devices, you should just join them directly to the cloud. So a lot of the Microsoft marketing message is driven by that. I think there's more complexity behind the scenes as to why that's the case. And a lot of it comes down to the use of Intune. Because if you think about the typical hybrid customer, what's to prevent a hybrid customer from continuing to use Config Manager and continue to use Active Directory and all of their other legacy technologies? Is that they do that, they're not a good customer for things like Intune Suite, because those sort of assume that you're actually using Intune for something beyond just the initial bootstrapping of the device, that you're actually managing the devices of Intune. So it's generally comes down to, well, where's the revenue opportunity? And in this case, the revenue opportunity is cloud native.
I mean, that makes sense, right? That's the push, and it does get harder. I've taken a lot of customers there, GPO to policy and map your drives. But I mean, I have customers that are 80, 90,000 seats in industries that it's just not that simple.
Yeah. And I think we started to see, well, probably not started, but for me, I started to see the backlash to that at MMS, with customers saying, well, you're just beating us over the head with this cloud native thing, that we're not ready for that. We don't want to do that yet. That we're looking at what benefits we could get out of something like Autopilot in the short term with our existing setup. Because we don't necessarily want to do a lot of imaging anymore, but we're not fully ready to move to cloud native. So what's wrong with hybrid? There are certainly some design flaws, like the whole AAD Connect device sync delays and getting signed on without a user token, and then you can't talk to Intune. And I mean, there are problems with it, but as long as you know how to work around those problems, the scenario ends up working well, and you get the benefit of devices that can be provisioned easily without having to go the imaging or task sequence route. So I think there are benefits, but the biggest headache, the biggest grumble I generally have around conversations like that is that there's no single absolute right answer that works for all customers, and marketing always says there is. So the marketing will always say, oh, cloud native, that's the only way that you would ever want to go. But reality is there are some valid scenarios where there is a better, or at least a different answer that is perfectly valid for you.
Yeah, I think that's what makes also, like, in the consulting or whatever I do in my line of work, I mean, if there was a single answer and it worked for everyone, we'd have no business. So it's like, right, taking the tools and figuring it out. It's funny. I was asking some people in my Discord, because I've been doing all these videos. I'm like, do you want me to, should I show hybrid join? Like, I haven't touched it. And like in the poll, like there was a lot of yes. And then same thing with Endes, because I did a cloud PKI thing. I'm like, does anyone want to see how to set up SCEP and Endes? And people were like, yeah. So just like, it's funny, like you're thinking, oh, well, this is great, but the ongoing cost or whatever might not be for everyone. So, why not at least share it's going to be around for a while, that stuff.
And I have the same sort of conversations around line of business apps versus Win32 apps. Like a lot of the samples that I published initially were single file MSIs, because they're easy to deploy and they get installed pretty quickly. But Microsoft says, well, don't mix. Well, don't mix unless you know what you're doing. If you don't know what you're doing and you intermix all these different app types, you're going to run into issues. But that doesn't mean thou must never deploy a line of business app via an MSI, because there are perfectly valid reasons. Like we've been using it recently to deploy an agent that we want to get onto the device as early as possible. And the line of business app will install well before Intune has ever figured out what Win32 apps need to be deployed to the device.
Or a sidecar, right? Or with the Intune management extension.
Pretty much in parallel to,
Okay.
With the Intune
Gotcha.
management extensions. They both get downloaded and installed just like that. But it's entertaining too that the number one conflict I tend to run into isn't between line of business apps and Win32 apps, because the LOB apps come through so quickly. It's actually between the Microsoft 365 apps and Win32 apps.
Yeah.
Because most people will look at it and say, oh, I'm going to use what's built into Intune to deploy Office to my devices. I'm not going to deliver it myself as a Win32 app. Why would I want to do something silly like that? But guess what? There are a variety of potential issues if you don't deliver Office as a Win32 app yourself. Like the end of the Office install process installs a series of MSIs. Well, guess what that can do while you're installing Win32 apps that also install MSIs? They trip over each other. So
it's interesting.
Ideally you move everything to Win32, and probably you move Office over to a Win32 app as well. But there are always going to be some exceptions to every rule. So that's generally my asterisk that I put next to all of these absolute statements, that unless you know better, unless you actually understand what's going on, sure, you can listen to that, but there are always exceptions to every rule.
Yeah, I think it's funny. Like, there's no, Autopilot is, in modern provisioning, I guess, is still considered, new by standard, compared to, what we have with System Center and deployment tools. But like, not a lot of this is exposed. And I think that's the problem too. I think when I talk to folks, they're listening to Microsoft marketing and they're kind of confused because they're like, what is the sequence? Like, when I explain, like, people don't know, like, and a lot of people won't look at, you have the Get Autopilot diagnostic script that kind of in plain text tells you, but like a lot of folks don't know. So like, even to make these decisions, like, there's not really good reference architecture out there yet. And maybe there won't be for some time. I don't know. It's just, it seems to be like a common thread where a lot of folks don't even understand it. Still.
Yeah, true. And I think that's sort of the hope, that it's just a black box. You don't need to worry about it like that. But the reality is, enough things go wrong that you kind of need to have that deeper level of understanding. Otherwise, you're never going to be able to diagnose issues.
Yeah, especially like, I look at pre-provisioning. A common issue I see all the time is folks will, go to a company and say, I'd like you to pre-provision my devices. And here they are. And the company goes, okay, 5 times. They have and who's to say what they built on their end? So it's like, yes, it's nice to be able to hand something off and not give someone credentials or access, but then on a customer side, it can be like, well, you're supposed to pre-provision them for me. What are you doing wrong? It's like, we can't do anything. Like, it's all on your side. And in my experience, a lot of folks don't necessarily configure Intune maybe the best way. They don't take into account pre-provisioning, because that's a little different, right? Even though it's not. So yeah, it's interesting there. So the other day, because I know we've talked about ARM a lot, Windows on ARM, and I've always been really excited for it, even though there's been some attempts. But this is kind of a big week. It wasn't just Surface. I guess Snapdragon dropped everything. So I guess initial thoughts on that. Looks good.
Everything looks good. The performance, battery life numbers, everything's pretty much where they would promised, which is a good thing. There were some interesting developments thrown in by Microsoft as well, saying that, well, they've improved the emulation performance by 20%. So every little bit helps. So yeah, I'm hopeful. But since I've been using an emulated Windows install running ARM64 for 6 months, I already think it's pretty solid. So anything they do that makes it even better would just make it more mainstream, that everyone else who's going to use this is probably going to look at it and say, oh, hey, this is just like a normal Windows install. Yeah, that's the point. All my apps work. Battery life's great. I don't need to carry chargers around with me, all that good stuff.
I think, and that's why I tell, like, there always seems to be this PC versus Apple war. That's never going to go away. I've always used both,
Yeah.
but I don't think anyone can deny Apple with the M series when it came. I mean, they kind of set that bar and said, this is what an ARM laptop should be. And it was like, I
Right.
mean, I remember seeing it the first time, like, is this thing like made of magic? Like, it's not getting hot. The battery barely drains. Like, what is inside of it? And
Yeah.
that kicked everyone in the pants. So it's a good thing in the end. Is there anything you want to share that you're working on, you know, where you're at now, or anything you want to promote, or, you know?
Well, I've been at 2Pint now for about 6 months, and we've been working on some OS deployment solutions, which I'm sure people will be hearing about in the future. I mean, it's no big surprise that my background is in that OS deployment space, worked on MDT in advance of Autopilot, and there is still a space for that sort of solution. So as Microsoft tries to sunset the MDT toolkit, there's still a need that maybe something doesn't need to be quite as complicated as what MDT or Config Manager OSC or something like that has been in the past. So a more simplified, maybe even a cloud-based provisioning capability. So that's what we're looking at this point. But apart from that, 2Pint specializes more in the network management side of things, which a lot of customers realize as they go down the Intune Autopilot route, that things like delivery optimization become really, really important.
Yeah.
So we do a lot of work on monitoring, tuning, and configuring delivery optimization so that you could actually get decent caching performance and not crush your network as you're deploying these devices.
I mean, that's critical. It's like both for first-time deployment and ongoing. I feel like what I always say about Autopilot is from a user experience perspective, you have very little margin for error, because if you start shipping devices to people and if your failure rate or your experience rate is not great and it's more than like 1%, like I mean, it's going to get a bad name, and I've seen it. I've seen people try to deploy Autopilot. All it takes is, like, you know, one special employee or C-level to be like, this sucks. I don't like it. I don't want to do this for my... Yeah. So I don't think people realize how much the network matters, and DO does get glazed over a lot, but it's pretty important. So, you know.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it also just comes down to the sheer quantity of network traffic being generated. Like in the past, I know people freaked out when we talked about Windows as a service initially, thinking, how am I possibly going to deploy a 4 gig OS image out to all my devices twice a year? Mm-hmm. No one ever did, but even once a year, that was a big payload. Now you can set up a brand new device using Autopilot and generate that much network traffic just in the initial provisioning process. Yeah. I know I was looking at some of the statistics that Johan Arwoodmark was generating, where he went through Autopilot, and you expect that, okay, I'm going to have network traffic for all the apps that I'm deploying, but then you just leave the device sitting and watch the network traffic continue even after the Autopilot process is done. As all of the Windows updates get installed in the background, and app updates get installed, and Edge updates itself, and OneDrive updates itself, and all these other things go on, you can easily generate gigabytes more traffic just from that background activity. And it doesn't go away either. It's just constantly pounding the network as everything constantly gets updated with new versions, new tweaks, and all that thing going on. So just the amount of noise that's generated by a typical PC that sits on your network, the noise is huge. So not having that optimized peer-to-peer experience, the tool set up, whether that's branch cache or delivery optimization or whatever it is based on the type of content that you're talking about, optimizing that saves your network overall, so that hopefully then something like Autopilot isn't the victim of all of this random background noise. Like there was a customer, I think it was last week or the week before, that had flipped the switch on Teams from old Teams to new Teams, and all their devices tried to update Teams at the same time. And the Teams updater, yes, is downloaded via delivery optimization, but it doesn't peer because it's being downloaded from an HTTPS source, and it generated terabytes of network traffic just updating Teams. Well, guess what breaks when there are terabytes of extra traffic on the network? Everything else. So no one blames Teams for what's going on, at least until you dig into the network traffic and see, oh my God, what the heck is going on my network? Why are all these machines downloading the same MSIX file from Microsoft?
Right.
Oh, no, yeah, we flipped that switch.
Mike, really appreciate you doing this. Sure everyone's going to get a kick out of it. Like I said, especially all the Autopilot Intune fans. So really appreciate it.